Panic at the Disco really exploded onto the scene. In just a couple of years, they'd gone from a bunch of friends rehearsing in Grandma's front room to a globe-spanning phenomenon. But such meteoric rise is always going to result in a few casualties. The friends that had been so tight ended up drifting apart, as creative and artistic rifts tore the band apart. And after a while, it wasn't even a band anymore. It was just one guy, Brendon Urie. Panic at the Disco was still a massive musical project, but it had become a solo act. And the days of fun emo invention and pop-punk innovation were long, long gone. So what happened? How does a band made up of high school buddies end up falling out? And how does the most exciting band on the planet fall off the face of the earth? Let's find out as we put the rise and the fall of Panic at the Disco under the microscope. Before the drama, there was a dream shared by four young friends from Summerlin, Las Vegas. Ryan Ross and Spencer Smith had been playing music together since 9th grade. When they decided to start a band in 2004, they invited Brent Wilson from a nearby high school to join them. Wilson brought his own friend, Brendon Urie, along to practice. And the rest is history. Well, not just yet it's not. We're still in our humble beginning stage. Rehearsing in Spencer Smith's grandmother's living room and working odd jobs around the area, the four knew they had talent. Once they'd stopped playing Blink-182 covers and started writing their own stuff, then they knew they had something special. They decided to commit to music in a big way. Now, usually at this part of the story, we'd cover years of struggle and heartache, defeat, disaster, and disenchantment with the industry, followed by eventual triumph. But that's not quite how it went down with Panic at the Disco. This is not to say they didn't work hard. They did. And it's not to say they didn't make sacrifices. Both Urie and Ross ended up ostracized by family members when they dropped out of school to focus on the band. It's just that things happened for Panic quick. Really quick. It all began to come together when Ross and Urie sent their demo tape to Fall Out Boy's Pete Wentz. They probably thought it was a 1,000,000-to-1 shot. Maybe it was. Sending a pop-punk demo to Wentz in 2004 was like an up-and-coming rapper sending a mixtape to Jay-Z. But it was a shot that paid off. Wentz fell head over heels in love with the demo. He drove out from LA to Las Vegas to meet the band and made them the first signing on his new Decadence label. Let's just take a moment here. We're talking about a band who has never played a show, has only recorded 2 songs, and now they're signed up with the biggest name in the genre. It's really fairy tale stuff. Maybe that's why the band got so into fairy tale inspired compositions later. But back in 2005, it meant something of a reality check. This was the early days of the social media era, and kids were not too happy that this bunch of upstarts from Nevada had landed the dream deal of a lifetime. Panic would need to step up to the plate and get to work on paying back the faith Wentz had shown in them. And that's exactly what they did. When they hit the studio in College Park, Maryland, they weren't just recording their debut. They were basically writing it. We didn't have a day off in the first 5.5 weeks we were there, 12 or 14 hours a day, Ross would later say. We were living in a 1-bedroom apartment with 4 people on bunk beds. Everyone got on everybody's nerves. Someone would write a new part for a song, and someone else would say they didn't like it, just because you ate their cereal that morning. It might have been a stressful session, but it was a successful one. The result was a fever you can't sweat out. A massive record that's half dancey electro-punk and half gothic theatrical rock. Making a record of 2 distinct halves seemed pretty cool at the time. It really showed how versatile the band could be. But perhaps it was an indication of a band who just couldn't make up their mind, creatively speaking. This indecision over who they were and where they wanted to go was going to cause problems further down the line. The music industry is driven by money, so it tends to fall into a distinct pattern. A cool, innovative band comes along and makes something new. Then a bunch of other bands come along, doing their own copies of that same thing. They're not as good, they're not as exciting, but for record labels, they're surefire winners. The public wants this kind of music, so the labels give the public what they want. And when the wave breaks and that music isn't cool anymore, the labels drop these bands like they're going out of fashion, which they are. So Panic at the Disco wouldn't need to do much to score a hit. They just needed to make a record that sounded like Fall Out Boys from under the cork tree, and kids would lap it up. But this was never the band's intention. They wanted to make something all their own. And I don't think this was Pete Wentz's intention in signing the band either. Why would he just want to help someone else rip off his own music? So while A Fever You Can't Sweat Out was written and recorded in a hurry, it's not just a Fall Out Boy clone record. It's way more than this. Sure, it sounded a bit like Fall Out Boy, and Brendon even sounded a bit like Patrick Stump, but these guys were going their own way. I Write Sins Not Tragedies really showcases this. It kicks off with Renaissance-style plucked strings and barrels into a pop-punk tragicomedy, part MCR rock opera and part Jacobean romantic drama. And of course, it's super danceable. It was a huge hit, not just with pop-punk kids, but with music fans from all walks of life too. And it propelled Panic at the Disco into superstardom. So the band had got what they wanted: fame, fortune, and the chance to bring their art to the masses. But at what cost? Their personal relationships were the first to suffer the pressure of fame. Panic had begun as friends first, musicians second, but now they were real stars, and this dynamic had to shift. So when Brent Wilson left the band in 2006, everyone wondered just what had gone on. Eventually, the band made their position clear. Brent had a lack of responsibility and was not progressing musically with the band. They even said he'd not written or played on any of the tracks on Fever. As you might expect, Wilson wasn't too happy about this, especially when he was denied a cut of the royalties. The bass player threatened to sue his former bandmates. The case was eventually settled out of court. It's not clear what happened to the royalties, but Wilson is still credited on copies of that first album. While all this was going on, Panic had drafted in John Walker as a replacement, and their artistry reached new and crazy heights. Their Nothing Rhymes with Circus tour of 2006 was less a punk rock show and more a traveling variety performance, featuring vaudevillian theater, endless costume changes, dance numbers, and even comedy skits. It was pretty awesome, truth be told. But Panic would need to do more than this if they were going to capitalize on their fame. They'd need new music too, and they need to write and record this while somehow holding the core of the band together. It's tempting to view Panic at the Disco as the Brendon Urie show. He was the charismatic frontman after all, and the emo icon. But actually, this wasn't the case at all. Ryan Ross was the creative driving force for early Panic. He wrote all the songs on A Fever You Can't Sweat Out and penned all the lyrics. For the second album though, Brendon was getting more involved in songwriting. He's credited as the main or sole writer on 5 of the second record's 15 tracks, with Ross receiving top credit on the rest. So what was this second album? Well, that would be pretty odd. Released in 2008, and it was quite a departure. They kind of left pop-punk behind. Instead, they fell into a 60s psychedelic groove. They channeled the likes of Sgt. Pepper-era Beatles or the Kinks' Village Green Preservation Society. They adopted the costumes of British guitar pop bands from years gone by, and they even laid down some of the record at the iconic Abbey Road studios in London. Ross was quite clear about what the band were creating. In his words, it was a modern fairy tale with a romantic twist. In other words, it wasn't going to sound anything like A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. Critics generally loved the band's new direction, and the record-buying public loved it too. The band scored a #1 album in Australia and peaked at #2 in the UK and US. Singles like 9 in the Afternoon and That Green Gentleman were radio-friendly hits, but with enough whimsy and weirdness to make them genuinely interesting. Anyone who had written Panic at the Disco off as just another emo band with a catchy single had gotten it wrong. Very, very wrong. And while the album was a massive success, it was also a crossroads for the band. They dabbled in polished guitar pop and in retro-influenced psychedelia, and it worked. But these are two very different paths. Which was it going to be? For Ryan Ross, it was the latter. He wanted to fully embrace that 60s sound and make something magical. For Urie, the former. He had a grand vision, and he wanted to turn it into polished pop reality. And not just necessarily guitar pop either. In the end, they just couldn't work it out. Ross might have been the principal songwriter, but he knew that fans were going wild for the elfin frontman Urie. He decided to leave the band, taking John Walker with him. So Panic at the Disco became a two-piece. The band would continue with just Brendon Urie and Spencer Smith. But they just lost their chief songwriter. What the hell were they going to do now? While the remaining members of Panic licked their wounds, Ryan Ross stayed true to his word. Along with members of Tilly and the Wall and the OCs, Ross and Walker formed the Young Vanes in 2009, creating music that's way more than just 60s inspired. It's pure 60s. The band released some cool tracks like Change, but unfortunately went on a lengthy hiatus soon after. They haven't recorded since. Meanwhile, Urie was stepping up to his role as Panic's chief songwriter. He began writing the new record with Spencer Smith, and the result was Vices and Virtues, released in 2011. It's clear from the outset why Brendon and Ryan couldn't get along. With a third record, Panic created a kind of Baroque pop festival of weirdness, conjuring up images of Danny Elfman's score for Nightmare Before Christmas, filtered through a dance floor-ready prism. It was a big-selling record. Not quite as big-selling as Pretty Odd, but still highly respectable, sailing high on the Billboard 200 for quite a while. And it was followed up by an intimate evening with Panic at the Disco, a tour that scaled back the pomp and majesty of the band's earlier performances in search of a deeper connection with fans. And these fans loved it. They loved all of it. And there was more to come. As soon as they'd got off tour, the duo were back in the writing and recording cycle. This time, Brendon's songwriting was heading in a hip-hop direction as he and Spencer Smith, along with new member Dallin Weeks, set about creating a full-on pop-rock record. This was Too Weird to Live, Too Rare to Die, released in 2013. It's a record with minimal guitar, minimal pop-punk aesthetic, maximum processed beats and soaring choruses. Single Miss Jackson isn't exactly a cover of the Outkast classic, but it does borrow heavily from the hip-hop smash hit. Meanwhile, Girls, Girls, Boys throws things back even further, recalling 80s glitch pop and synth-heavy electro records. It also features a video containing very little except for a close-up of Brendon Urie's face. Panic at the Disco were still just about a band, but increasingly, they looked like a solo vehicle for Brendon and his own vision. Brendon even appears, all by himself, on the record's cover. Were the other members of the band going to accept this? Or did Brendon even want to be in a band anymore? Perhaps he'd be happier going it alone. It'll come as a surprise to absolutely no one that Panic at the Disco, as a band, did not survive that fourth record. In 2015, Spencer Smith announced that he'd left the group. Later that year, Dallin Weeks, who had been promoted from the position of touring bass player to fully fledged band member, was busted back down a rank. He would no longer be an official member of Panic at the Disco. In fact, now there was only one official member of Panic at the Disco, and that was Brendon Urie. If Urie had been a little nervous about becoming the project's principal songwriter, he'd handled it pretty well. By now, he had a clear picture of what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was 2016's Death of a Bachelor. Leading with the single Hallelujah, Brendon slotted into his new role as solo artist remarkably well. It was almost like he'd pretty much been a solo artist already for the last couple of records. Hallelujah is a pretty good tune, although if you didn't know the backstory of Brendon and Panic, then you wouldn't realize it had anything to do with pop-punk and emo at all. It's a pure, modern pop song, with samples and record scratches, and a nice bit of gospel backing thrown in for good measure. Needless to say, it was a hit. Urie followed it up with another live album, showcasing his grand theatrical vision. There are a couple of nods to the early stuff in the live set, but mainly it's a collection of tracks from the last few records, with a couple of covers too, from Queen and Billy Joel, of course. Urie was supposed to have a break after this, but the creative energy was flowing through him. He started writing straight away, and also made a move into the world of musical theater with a lead role in a Broadway production of Kinky Boots. It's no surprise then that his next album, Pray for the Wicked, sounds very Broadway-influenced. Brendon had always been theatrical and dramatic, but now he'd turned it up a notch, especially on tracks like Hey Look Ma, I Made It. Now Brendon could take a break. But after the project had been so prolific over the past few years, fans were worried after 2 years, then 3 went by with no news of a new album. Finally, 4 years later, Brendon returned with Viva Las Vengeance, a heavy nod to the Viva Las Vegas debauchery of his hometown. It's still a pop record, but it's more influenced by 1950s doo-wop than 2010s hip-hop. There's a rockier, retro-y feel to the album that I guess Ryan Ross would have appreciated. But any fans who'd been worried Brendon was running out of steam after a 4-year absence were about to be proven right. This blaze of 50s splendor and old-style rock and roll pop was going to be Panic's swan song. At the beginning of 2024, less than a year after the last album was released, Brendon Urie made a statement. There was no big fanfare, no dramatic revelation, just the news that Brendon's wife was expecting a baby, and that the singer was bringing an end to the project so he could focus on his family. So that was it. A band that had exploded onto the scene without even playing a show, then developed a reputation for some of the most ostentatious live performances this side of Lady Gaga, was done. The group of friends who had gradually been whittled down to just one guy was now no guys. It was nothing. Finito. There is a slight caveat to this, however. In October 2024, Panic at the Disco were added to the lineup of the When We Were Young festival, a mega celebration of all things pop-punk and emo. It makes sense. 20 years after dropping one of the definitive albums of that era, it'd be weird if these guys weren't there. But which guys is it going to be? Surely not just Brendon by himself. So maybe Brendon, Dallin, and Spencer. I guess Brent Wilson isn't going to be making an appearance. The former bassist was jailed for 46 months in November 2022 for possession with intent to distribute. But is John going to be there? Or Ryan? I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I wouldn't go expecting a new Panic album off the back of it. At least, not a pop-punk album. In the meantime, what's your favorite era of Panic at the Disco? I guess most of you are going to say the early stuff, but I'd like to know your thoughts, so let me know in the comments. As always, thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe, and stick tight for another wild ride through the world of pop-punk and emo, coming right up.